Okay, so you want to own a medieval licensed brothel. In your head, it's simple: rent rooms by the river, take a cut of every transaction, and the church looks the other way. The church is not looking away. In Southwark, the bishop whose court can damn you for the sin happening upstairs is also your landlord, and he bought the ground under your building in the 1140s. He isn't tolerating your business, he's leasing it to you. Start with the part nobody believes. You don't earn a percentage here, you take a cut of nothing. You don't even particularly care how many customers walk through that door tonight, and we'll show you why. By the end, you'll know the weekly rate this business ran on, which revenue stream the law amputated, and which guilds lobbied for it, and why a licensed brothel isn't a sex business at all. It's real estate with a morality tax stapled to it. One more thing before we start. Buried in the 1161 rulebook is a clause that decides who goes to prison when this business breaks. It is not the man at the top. We'll show you exactly how that clause closes. 3 tiers, and they buy you 3 completely different things. Bottom tier, you lease a town-owned house in a mid-sized German city, the kind the Council of Nördlingen ran through the 1400s. You bid at auction, swear a formal oath of obedience to the council, and get one building, a dozen women, and pricing you don't control. Rates were set against a journeyman's daily wage because the city wanted its own tradesmen able to afford it. What you get for the money is a kitchen. In Germany, you may sell food and wine on your premises, and that one permission turns out to matter more than anything else in this video. Middle tier, you're a stew holder on Bankside in Southwark, operating under the ordinances touching the government of the stew holders, signed by Henry II in 1161, 39 written rules, administered by the Bishop of Winchester. Your rent goes to the bishop's estate, your fines go to the bishop's court. Your disputes are heard by the bishop's officials. What you get for that is the most valuable amenity in the trade, a river. Clients crossed the Thames from a landing at Stew Lane specifically so they'd never be seen walking through their own parish. You're buying purpose-built discretion. Top tier, you stop running houses and start owning ground. In 1107, the abbot of Bermondsey leased 70 acres of Bankside, every major brothel and every violent tavern on it, to the Bishop of Winchester for £8 a year. In the 1140s, Henri de Blois stopped renting and bought the lot outright. Elsewhere on this tier, city councils built the house themselves and leased the running of it out, which tells you which half of the arrangement they thought was worth keeping. That's the top of this market, and we'll come back to what it earned. Now, the costs nobody mentions at the auction. Registration: every new woman has to be entered with the bishop's officials, and failing to do it costs you 40 shillings. Inspection: constables search every house weekly and quarterly to check nobody is held there against her will. You're audited 52 times a year. Branding: literally. Every woman must wear an agreed garment marking her trade and is banned from wearing an apron, because aprons marked respectable women. Your workforce is required by law to be identifiable on site. Collection: if a customer refuses to pay, you may not hold him and you may not settle it yourself. The dispute goes to the bishop's court, which means chasing a bad debt costs you an appearance in front of the same officials who fine you. Custody: anything a customer leaves with you for safekeeping, down to his sword and belt, has to come back to him intact, and a lost item is 20 shillings. And one more: the rulebook caps what you may lend a woman at 6 shillings and 8 pence, and voids anything above it. Somebody in 1161 already knew exactly how these houses really made their money. So where does the money actually come from? Think about a barber shop that rents out chairs. The barber pays for his chair by the week, whether or not a single customer walks in. The shop owner isn't in the haircut business, he's in the chair business, and haircuts are just what makes the chairs worth renting. That is precisely a Southwark brothel, and once you see it that way, every strange rule in the ordinances snaps into focus. Rule 9 of the 1161 ordinances: every woman working in a stew pays the stew holder 14 pence a week for her chamber. Not a cut, not a commission. Rent: fixed, weekly, owed in a dead week and a busy week alike. Your income doesn't move with trade. Hers does. Here's your first marker, because this is where everyone's mental picture breaks. As a stew holder, you were in law, a landlord, and the ordinances went out of their way to keep you one and nothing more. Rule 36 forbids you from selling food or drink on the same premises where your women work. Rule 20 forbids the women from spinning or carding wool during their downtime. Neither of those is about morality. The first protects the surrounding taverns from a competitor with a captive audience. The second protects the textile guilds from cheap labor. Two of the most powerful lobbies in medieval London reached into a brothel rulebook and each carved out a revenue stream so it could never touch them. The German houses kept their kitchens. The English ones were legally stripped down to bed rent. Now run the number because 14 pence sounds like nothing. It is nothing. A few days of food. Multiply it by 52 weeks and one chamber generates 728 pence a year. Just over £3 before anybody has sold anything to anyone. Put 6 chambers in your house and that's roughly £18 a year in rent alone. For scale, in that same century, running an average castle for a year cost about £16, and the wealthiest baron in England took in under 700. 6 beds out earn a castle. And remember what the bishop paid for the whole district, £8 a year for 70 acres. 3 women's bed rent covers the ground rent for all of Bankside. That gap between what the ground costs and what the beds on it pay is the entire business, and everyone in this story is positioned somewhere along it. And the gap stayed open because the theology held it open. Thomas Aquinas compared a town's red light district to the cesspool in a palace. Remove it, and the whole palace stinks. That single comparison is what let a bishop collect this rent for 400 years without ever having to explain himself. Second marker. And this one's uglier. Because English law killed your food markup, the only direction left to expand your margin was lending. Rule 6 caps loans to a woman at 6 shillings and 8 pence, about 6 weeks of chamber rent, and voids anything larger in the bishop's court. The German record shows what happens where no such cap holds. In the Nördlingen investigation of 1471, the women testified that the keeper charged 13 pence for a meal available for 12 elsewhere in town, and that wine cost a penny more inside the house than outside it. Else von Nürnberg said she'd handed over a veil worth 2 florins on arrival and still owed money for the skirt she wore to work. Others said their clothes were confiscated whenever they owned anything good. 1 penny of markup, 3 meals a day, 12 women, 365 days. That arithmetic alone runs past 13,000 pence a year. It compounds into debt nobody can clear, and it never gets split with anybody. So the income comes in 3 streams. Chamber rent, the reliable core, owed regardless of trade, and in Southwark, the overwhelming majority of what you take. Lodging, Rule 27 requires you to let each woman's last customer of the day stay the night, which quietly makes you an innkeeper as well. And credit, the smallest stream per transaction, and the most dangerous, which is exactly why the law tried to cap it, because it's the one that converts a tenant into an asset you effectively own. The formula: your revenue equals chambers, times weeks those chambers are occupied, times 14 pence, plus whatever you can lend against. And every single thing in this business, the river landing, the marked garments, the debt, the 4th-century license, exists to keep chambers occupied. You've seen this shape without noticing. Anywhere the casinos and the strip clubs cluster half a mile past a county line. Same machine, 900 years later. The activity isn't banned. It's relocated to whichever jurisdiction gets paid. First insider term, a liberty. Southwark was one, a zone where neither the City of London nor the County of Surrey held authority, because the king had handed the rights of justice to a single lord. Whoever held it collected the rents, ran the courts, kept the fines. Second term, a court leet, the manorial court where those fines landed. Hold both, and 4 details in the rulebook stop looking like regulation and start looking like architecture. Detail 1, Rule 8, caps your staff at your wife, 1 washerwoman, 1 ostler. A hard legal ceiling on how large any house can grow. You cannot scale by statute, which conveniently means no operator ever gets big enough to negotiate with the bishop. Detail 2, Rule 25 caps that ostlers contract at 6 months because big capable men were wanted for the army, not permanently parked as brothel muscle. Detail 3, the overnight stay requirement and the ban on running your own boats both exist to suppress night traffic on the Thames. A boat crossing back at 3 in the morning hides a plotter, as well as it hides a customer. Detail 4, the sharpest. The fine for knowingly taking a nun or another man's wife into your house is 12 pence. 1 shilling. Exactly 1 week of chamber rent. The penalty is smaller than the revenue from committing the offense, and somebody did that arithmetic in 1161 and wrote it down anyway. Third term, this one German, the Rugebrauch. In some towns, a woman accused of illicit sex was marched to the public brothel in a formal procession and left there. Her honor was gone, the house had a new tenant, and the town's recruitment cost was nothing. The labor pipeline was a civic ceremony, and once you accept that this is infrastructure and not vice, the strangest surviving anecdote in the trade stops being strange. In 1471, the Emperor Frederick III arrived at the gates of Nuremberg and was ceremonially captured by the city's licensed prostitutes with a golden chain and paid a 1 florin ransom to be released. That isn't a scandal. That's a city deploying a licensed municipal asset in a state welcome, the way it would deploy its guilds or its bells. Then there's the zoning, which was deliberate and expanding. Around 1242nd licensed street opened outside the London walls and got nicknamed Cock Lane. It's still on the map. In 1285, Edward I ordered every prostitute out of the walls or into jail for 40 days, which didn't suppress the trade. It herded it into the districts already licensed and already collecting. And by 1287, the dean and chapter of St. Paul's Cathedral owned property on Cock Lane they knew perfectly well was let as brothels. Not tolerated, held the freehold, and collected on it. In this industry, the most profitable position available is the one where you never have to be the person unlocking the door. So if 14 pence a week is that reliable, why did operators keep going under? Everything else. Start with fines because they aren't rare events. They're a subscription. The fine for a woman tugging at a passing man's coat is 20 shillings. A full pound, 4 months of her chamber rent for one gesture. And the surviving court records show those cases came up constantly for centuries, which tells you the rule was never really enforced as deterrence. It was harvested as income. Impede a constable's search, 100 shillings. Open on a holy day, 50. Fail to register a woman, 40, plus she's fined, ducked in the cucking stool, and expelled from the liberty, which costs you the chamber too. 39 separate ways to lose a month's revenue. Inspected weekly. Then the closures you don't control. Holy days. Every day Parliament sits at Westminster. Plague. When the Black Death reached England, cities shut the public bathhouses as an infection risk while keeping the brothels open under tighter watch, so you absorbed a facilities closure and more scrutiny in the same season with no relief on rent. And politics. Henry V shut the Southwark bathhouses entirely on the eve of sailing for France, because a pious king departing for war doesn't want that in the background. Then churn, which is the cost nobody models. Women left through marriage, often financed by charities set up specifically to buy them out of the trade with a dowry. They left through disease, which the rulebook itself acknowledges by fining you for keeping a woman who's visibly ill. And they left through death. The women who died here were buried in unconsecrated ground at what's now Crossbones Graveyard. Every departure is an empty chamber earning 0 until you refill it, and refilling it means registration, and registration means the bishop's officials again. Now, the clause we promised you. Rule 24. Any constable or bailiff who knows about a breach and fails to report it can be imprisoned until he pays whatever fine the court decides. No ceiling, no schedule. Open-ended, entirely at the court's discretion. Read that as a business owner. The people inspecting you are personally, financially terrified of that court, which means they cannot afford leniency toward you even when they'd like to sell you some. And the court setting that fine, hearing that case, and pocketing that money is your landlord's court. You are not being regulated by the state. You're being regulated by your landlord using the state's letterhead. Nördlingen shows where it ends. When the council moved in 1471, the person who answered was the man holding the lease. Leinhard Freiermuth was convicted and banished from the city. His partner Barbara Tarshenfeinden was branded on the forehead and pilloried. Nobody above them in the chain. explained anything to anyone. Your rent is collected weekly. Your license is reviewed constantly. Your fines are set at someone else's discretion. All three of those decisions belong to your landlord. Two failure modes over and over. The first is building your margin on arrangements a council can outlaw in a single afternoon. That's Nördlingen, 1471. Leinhard Freiermuth and his partner Barbara Tarschenfeinden held the lease on the town's public house with 12 women living in it. That December, the council opened an investigation after word got out about the treatment of Else von Eistedt, a kitchen maid who had been pushed into prostitution and then forced by the madam to end a pregnancy against her will. The council interrogated all 12 women and cooperated with the councils of Nuremberg and Weissenberg to reach the ones who had already left town. Here's the part that matters commercially. The testimony that convicted them was overwhelmingly financial, not the violence, the marked-up meals, the confiscated clothing, the debts nobody could ever clear. Every mechanism that produced Freiermuth's margin was, in the same breath, the evidence against him. By January 1472, it was finished. He was banished. She was branded. The record runs to 40 pages of parchment still held in the town archive, and the following year the council rewrote the brothel regulations specifically to ban the financial arrangements he'd built the business on. The business sold for nothing, because there was nothing to sell. The lease didn't transfer, it evaporated. The rule: if your margin depends on terms your licensing authority can void in one session, you don't own a business. You own a countdown. And note the timing. From the first rumor to the verdict was about 6 weeks. This industry doesn't wind down. It stops. The second failure mode is slower, and it killed far more operators, treating revocable permission like an asset you hold title to. In 1501, the city fathers of Frankfurt put the management of their own municipal brothel up for auction, and nobody bid. Not a low price. No price. A protected municipal monopoly in one of the great trading cities of Europe went to auction and cleared 0 cents on the dollar 59 years before the house was formally closed in 1560. And Frankfurt was early. Not unusual. Augsburg closed in 1532. Basel in 1534. Henry VIII shut Southwark in 1546, ending a licensed trade that had run continuously since 1161. Seville closed in 1621, Amsterdam in 1625. In every case, operators who had spent years building working capital, debt ledgers, and supplier relationships around a state-granted monopoly found out that the state's mood, not their ledger, had always been the actual asset. Here's the analogy that should sting. It's putting everything you have into a hot dog cart whose entire value comes from a permit to park in one specific plaza, and then being amazed when the next council votes the carts out and you discover you never owned a cart business at all. You owned a permission slip, issued by people who could withdraw it for free, and you were only ever renting that. One group in this story never lost money: the people who owned the ground and never once ran a house. The bishopric of Winchester held Bankside for more than 4 centuries and became the richest see north of Milan, with brothel and tavern income named as part of the reason. The pattern repeats everywhere you look. The Bishop of Albi claimed the right to license and cite his town's brothel. The Abbey of Saint-Étienne owned the baths of Saint-Michel in Dijon. In Florence, respectable families including the Medici owned the city's bordellos as landlords, while a dedicated magistracy called the Onesta handled every dispute, so the owners were never the ones standing in front of a judge. Rosiade, working through 15th century French archives, found the same thing at scale. Clerics and municipal officials weren't merely tolerating this trade, they were its principal beneficiaries, and they owned and used these houses openly. Their playbook runs 6 steps. 1. Never operate. Lease the house to somebody whose name goes on the paperwork and who absorbs the legal exposure. 2. Take a fixed ground rent that doesn't move with trade, so a bad decade costs you nothing. 3. Own the court as well as the land, So every fine your tenant pays is income to you rather than leakage out of the system. 4. Make it one line inside a portfolio. Rents, taverns, court fines, even the prison. Never the whole business. 5. Watch the religious weather and renegotiate before the crackdown rather than after it. 6. Keep it immortal. De Blois bought Bankside in his official capacity rather than his personal one, so it passed automatically to every successor. The bishopric functioned as a corporation that cannot die, which is why it outlasted every single tenant it ever had. Running the house is a job. Owning the ground under it is a business. Owning the court that finds the house is a monopoly. Let's step back for a second. How is a business with a guaranteed 14 pence a week also a business that keeps destroying the people who run it? Because the guarantee was never issued to them. It was issued over their heads to somebody else. Compare it to something plain. A Southwark baker. He has no protected zone, no licensing bishop, no 4th century charter, and his margins are worse than yours. But nobody takes a cut of his dough. No court leet fines him 20 shillings because of how a customer behaved on his doorstep. No inspector walks through his shop 52 times a year, and no royal proclamation has ever abolished bread. If the bread is good, the shop is his, and it stays his. His business is fragile, and his ownership is real. Yours is the exact inverse. Revenue so predictable you could set a clock by it, sitting on top of ownership that is entirely borrowed and revocable without notice. That's the trade this industry actually runs on. You are renting certainty from a man who never has to buy any. Every stew holder on Bankside was, in effect, paying for predictability with the deed to his own future. Which leaves exactly one question worth asking, and it isn't whether the business works. It clearly works. It worked for 385 years. It's which side of that arrangement anybody ever actually got rich on. So what do you actually walk away with? 2 scenarios, both built from the documented rates. Scenario 1, modest. You take the lease on a 6-chamber Bankside house around 1400. Your capital outlay is small, the lease, a license fee to the bishop's court, a registration for each woman, because you're not building anything and you're not buying equipment. Gross. About £18 a year in chamber rent, plus whatever the overnight lodging adds. Against that, ground rent to the bishopric, your license, and fines. 2 of those 20-shilling solicitation fines is £2, 11% of your gross, and the court records say those cases came up constantly. One unregistered woman is 40 shillings more, and you lose her chamber on top of it. In a clean year, you clear somewhere around 12 to 13 pounds. Payback on your lease runs in months rather than years, because the asset was never the building, which sounds excellent, and it is. Right up to 1546, when Henry VIII abolished the entire trade by proclamation, and every payback calculation any stew holder on Bankside had ever made became irrelevant in an afternoon. Boring, durable, and confiscable, which is the honest summary of the whole tier. This is a good living, and it is never at any point your property. Scenario 2. The top of the market. And here's the last turn. The largest fortune in this story was made by someone who never operated a brothel, never took a cut of a single transaction, and never once had to be in the building. In 1107, the bishopric of Winchester leased 70 acres of Bankside for £8 a year. In the 1140s, Henry de Blois, bishop from 1129, brother to King Stephen, powerful enough that Henry II couldn't move against him, stopped leasing and bought it outright, then built Winchester House on the site, positioned between the church that is now Southwark Cathedral on one side and the Clink prison on the other. Godly authority to his left, enforcement to his right. From then on, the bishopric collected ground rent from every house on that land, a license fee from every stew holder, and every fine its own courts handed down from 12 pence to £10 a case. And it kept collecting from 1161 to 1546, 385 years through plague, war, and 4 dynasties. And it never once had to be the accused. Stew holder breaks a rule, the bishop's court collects. Woman breaks a rule, the bishop's court collects. Constable covers for either, the bishop's court collects from him too. Every outcome of every dispute inside 70 acres terminated in the same purse. Here's the number that ends the argument. An £8 a year lease turned into the richest bishopric north of Milan in a century when the wealthiest baron in England took in under £700 a year. And here's what everyone under him missed. The stewholder thought his monopoly was the house. The woman in the chamber thought the house belonged to the stewholder. The constable at the door thought he worked for the law. All three were tenants of the same man in the same building, and every fine they paid landed in one purse. The monopoly was never the brothel. The monopoly was the right to sit underneath everybody else's business and get paid whichever way it went. So, after all of that, you still want to own a medieval licensed brothel. Fair enough, it's a real business and it paid. Just remember that the bishop who could damn you for what happens in that building already ran this exact analysis. He looked at the beds, and the chairs, and the courts, and the ground underneath all of it. And then he bought the ground and left the beds to you.